Buonasera a tutte e a tutti, io mi chiamo Luca Geri e sono uno dei redattori della Voce delle lotte, la rivista online della frazione internazionalista rivoluzionaria, che è un'organizzazione comunista affiliata alla rete internazionale della frazione trotskista, di cui fa parte Left Voice, un foglio americano di cui è redattrice Julia Wallace, la compagna con cui mi confronterò nel corso di queste due iniziative. Sono due perché abbiamo deciso di suddividere la nostra intervista in una coppia di incontri virtuali tra oggi e il 23 dicembre. Useremo questo momento di incontro per provare a fare ordine mentale di un contesto quanto mai centrale e problematico, ovvero quello della nazione imperialista più influente e importante del mondo, ovvero gli Stati Uniti d'America, alle prese con una transizione di potere particolarmente segnata da eventi di portata storica. Il passaggio di testimone da Trump a Biden è l'argomento centrale di questa prima parte di presentazione. Sarebbe già stato considerato travagliato in condizioni pre-pandemiche. Lo dimostrano le complesse dinamiche dei rapporti di forza interne ai due partiti istituzionali, ovvero quello repubblicano, che è impegnato a gestire il suo tentativo di espansione in demografiche non tradizionali, come la comunità latinoamericana e quella afroamericana, in concomitanza con l'ascesa dell'ala che a tutti gli effetti fa riferimento al 45esimo presidente degli Stati Uniti, ovvero Donald Trump, e che ha abilitato nel corso della sua stagione governativa le espressioni reazionarie più violenti e sovrastrutturalmente razziste che la società capitalista predatoria è stata in grado di figliare. I rapporti quindi tra di questo partito e ovviamente di quello democratico, vincitore delle elezioni, in cui il braccio di ferro tra il centrismo tradizionale, che trova la sua ragion d'essere nel filo rosso che lega assieme la famiglia Clinton, Al Gore, Barack Obama e ovviamente il presidente eletto Joe Biden, ultimo ma non per importanza, è l'apparente spinta progressista di nuovi volti della politica del centro-sinistra, facenti capo a Bernie Sanders, l'ex candidato presidenziale che ha subito diciamo, una serie di misure e provvedimenti dalla Convention nazionale dei democratici che hanno praticamente impossibilitato la sua ascesa al potere come vertice e candidato presidenziale del partito. Quest'ala ha visto una sconfitta e quindi conseguenzialmente una vittoria della prima tendenza, con un ripiego travestito da ritirata tattica dei progressisti che ha creato solo disillusione in una nuova generazione di attivisti ed elettori che oggi sono disposti nelle strade, così come nelle urne, a rivendicare misure necessarie alla loro sopravvivenza. Lo scoppio della pandemia del Covid-19 ha ovviamente ulteriormente allargato il divario economico tra ceti sociali, già profondamente ampio e a suo modo contraddistinto da una razzializzazione tutta specifica al contesto americano, almeno nella natura di questa razzializzazione stessa. Ovviamente la divisione razzista è una cosa che è percepita in tutto il mondo, ma con dinamiche molto diverse da paese a paese. E, le lotte degli infermieri, dei lavoratori essenziali sono arrivate nel corso della prima ondata a legarsi inestricabilmente a una nuova esplosiva spinta propulsiva che dalle metropoli, in cui la violenza razzista contraddistingue e scandisce i ritmi della vita quotidiana in maniera più evidente, è arrivata a contagiare ogni angolo della nazione, fino a valicare i confini nazionali per diventare una serie di parole d'ordine che oggi marchiano a fuoco questo 2020 così brutale per un sacco di persone, ovvero Black Lives Matter, che è un movimento che ancora oggi influenza e pervade il discorso pubblico statunitense e, per quanto il 2020 sarà ricordato come un anno di svolta per le rivendicazioni della comunità nera, le frustrazioni e il dolore che oggi mostra tutto il mondo hanno radici lontane e nascondono legami con i movimenti della classe operaia più attivi nei luoghi di lavoro che forze tanto reazionarie quanto dichiaratamente liberali hanno provato a recidere. La dimensione classista, tuttavia, di questa crisi e della sua gestione sarà un argomento topico dei mesi a venire, perché mentre parliamo la pandemia continua a protrarsi in un paese che ha abbondantemente dimostrato di essere al punto di rottura. E al timone di esso troviamo una classe politica che, al netto di che colore voglia mostrare ai suoi elettori, serve gli interessi del capitalismo e delle tendenze più sfruttatrici dell'economia nazionale ed internazionale. Questi saranno argomenti centrali della prima parte della nostra presentazione, la quale sarà conclusa da una serie di considerazioni, che usciranno il 23, sul lavoro che possiamo aspettarci dai socialisti americani andando avanti in questo scenario. su come relazionarsi con le spinte cooptatrici del Partito Democratico dei vari movimenti sociali e su che direzioni questi movimenti sociali dovrebbero prendere per andare avanti, ma soprattutto su che futuro può avere questo paese così complesso e che sembra catturare la nostra attenzione e stimolare la nostra immaginazione di elaborazione politica ogni volta che tenda a muoversi. Ora farò una bellissima metamorfosi in una maglietta che non è questa qui, e passo alla nostra feature presentation. Per quanto mi riguarda, almeno in questo formato, noi ci rivedremo il 23 di dicembre, quando aggiungeremo alla nostra presentazione altri argomenti come per esempio appunto la formazione di nuovi e importanti corpi a sinistra del Partito Democratico, il rapporto che si è sviluppato con questi, tematiche come l'autodifesa, l'auto-organizzazione, la gestione degli spazi e l'idea stessa delle occupazioni, che ha assunto nuovi e interessanti caratteri durante il corso delle mobilitazioni di quest'anno. Ricordiamo che sono dinamiche decisamente diverse da quelle che conosciamo noi, magari qua in Italia, oppure anche in Europa. L'idea di occupazione, le occupazioni di spazi hanno una storia molto diversa negli Stati Uniti d'America e, specie in questo periodo, hanno ricoperto ruoli molto importanti, specie in un paese dove la discussione politica e le opportunità di elaborazione politica sono sempre coperte dall'ombra minacciosa dei partiti tradizionali ed istituzionali. Quindi argomenti come questi verranno discussi nella presentazione del 23 dicembre. Per quanto mi riguarda, stiamo parlando di un argomento a cui io tengo molto e su cui ho scritto parecchio e di cui vorrei rendere la mia vita anche lavorativa partecipe andando avanti, e molto di quello che io ho scritto lo potete trovare insieme ad altri contributi di altri compagni, oltre che alla traduzione in italiano di un sacco di contributi di Left Voice, sul nostro sito, lavocedell'otte.it, oppure in tanti post della nostra pagina Facebook, che io vi invito a seguire, sulla quale voi state vedendo, molto probabilmente già la seguite se state seguendo questa presentazione, ma nel caso vi invito a mettere mi piace, seguire la pagina, condividere i contenuti che produciamo e sì, in generale seguirci e darci una mano nel nostro tentativo di provare a costruire una società che funzioni per la classe operaia e che dalla classe operaia sia gestita in tutte le sue espressioni e mirata, diciamo, a distruggere e abbattere il capitalismo e le forme di oppressione che ha sviluppato per potersi mantenere saldamente al timone del mondo in cui viviamo. Buona serata. So we are now here with Julia Wallace, Comrade Julia Wallace from Left Voice. She is a community health worker from Los Angeles, born and raised, so she knows the area and the situation. Thanks for being with us, Julia. How are you today?
Great. Solidarity to the comrades in Italy and all over the world. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being with us. Thank you for helping us try and understand, you know, the complicated time frame in which we all find ourselves trying to operate both as human beings, you know, and both politically. So I'm going to start off with just a general question, and it is that in regards to the general political perspectives of the wider populace, how would you say the situation has changed in the past year and a half, both on a national and a more local level?
Right. So there's been, I mean, everybody calls 2020 a phenomena, and for good reason. There's been so much that's happened in the past year and even before then, from the wave of teacher strikes that happened, including in the Los Angeles area, to West Virginia and other states around the country, to the pandemic and the economic crisis, which are not the same thing, but are intertwined in many ways, as well as the Black Lives Matter movement, which erupted again with even more fervor and an even more of a deeper national and international character and of course the defeat of Donald Trump. So there's just been so much that's happened since the beginning of the last year and a half. And I think we're in for more of a historic kind of precedents that are going to be happening in the coming months and the next Biden administration. Locally, there's no different in that. We in Los Angeles, which is in California, had some of the biggest uprisings against police brutality in the last months. Also now has some of the highest cases of COVID in the country, and it's growing, cases and deaths as well. And also we are facing the threat of austerity. Already city and public employees have faced furloughs and layoffs, and many of us continue to be faced with that, even in the face of a Democratic Party governor, mayor, and total administration. And we can talk more about that. But Los Angeles there was a big teacher strike here. So really a lot of the stuff that's been reflected in the rest of the country has also been reflected locally.
Okay, thanks for, just clarifying, and especially the point about local administrators being Democratic, and California, such a specific situation, and this is a small insert I'm going to put right in here, because we've been having in Italy a wave of writers' strikes with Uber Eats and Deliveroo and all these kinds of services, and it all spawned from this bill that was passed in California just recently, the famous Proposition 12, I believe it was called. It was this thing.
The Uber one?
The Uber one, yeah, I believe.
Yeah, I think that was the 21. I think that's what it
21,
was.
yeah, 21. Yes, absolutely. And people were talking about it here actually, and because it was all, and it's interesting because in the stereotype one would think Democratic administration, but as we know, just parties of capital.
Yeah, the Democratic Party and Republican Party are both, of course, parties of capital and imperialism and racism. I think, though, they maybe have more strategic differences, but still, because of all the things that have been happening, and also kind of wanted to circle back a little bit, I think in part, the intensity and fury of the Black Lives Matter movement was also a reflection of COVID, the lockdowns, and also essential precarious workers, and the deaths and contractions of COVID-19 were disproportionately of working class Black Latino communities. And so it's not a coincidence then that this uprising happened that was a focus of those communities, as well as the healthcare workers that also fought back against the COVID crisis. I think that with the Democrats and Republicans, both of these parties are in a crisis, because the pandemic and the election both called into question the legitimacy of the capitalist state in various ways.
Okay, yeah, no, I totally agree. So another question is, this situation, at least from the perspective of electoral politics, obviously Trump and the nature of the Republican Party in 2020, we got to think back to 2016. So Trump's previous victory in 2016 in states like maybe Michigan and Wisconsin had been read as just a total collapse in relations between the Democratic Party and the world of labor, organized labor and non-organized labor. So maybe more of the industrial kind. And would you say this feeling has changed today, after the election and with Biden?
I think that, well, as typically, the union bureaucracy put tons of workers' monies into the Biden campaign. And I think in comparison to 2016, when Trump had never been president or really held any local office, he was seen as kind of an outsider. And for a lot of people thought Trump was representing this outsider that's gonna, although he's rich, he's gonna attack these kind of established bureaucrats. And in many ways, indirectly, it was an indictment of the Democratic Party neoliberal agenda, and people losing confidence and faith in them. But this time, this time in 2020, this was an indictment of Trump's administration. And even though he lost in Michigan and Wisconsin, he lost by very narrow margins, and so narrow that he was able to contest, although unsuccessfully, the electoral votes. And why is that? I think that, and this is why the Democratic Party in ways is in crisis, is because of all the things that happened, all the scandals, all the firings, all the lies, the pandemic, which the entire Republican and Trump administration bungled and caused so many people to die. The Democratic Party couldn't pose themselves as really much of an alternative. And so they barely won. So they did win in those states, but they won by, what was it? I think in Michigan, it was 29.5 to Trump's 28.8. I mean, barely 2%, 1%. And then in Wisconsin, it was 50.6 to 47.8. So these are just barely percentage margins. But the other point that I wanted to make sure to also make is that more people who were eligible to vote didn't vote. There's more of those people than people who voted for Trump or Biden, is people who just totally abstained. And I think that really speaks to people's disillusionment, and again, the crisis of just not being legitimate. And I think that's also why the capitalist class, even the Supreme Court, which is stacked with Republicans, has refused to defend Trump. I think they are more concerned about capitalist stability meaning people going to work, being exploited without fighting back, than having a Trump administration, which would incur even more wrath and distrust in the entire system from the working class and oppressed sectors.
Okay, yeah, no, that kind of leeways into my next question, about COVID. And it was obviously a macabre joke that we had in the household here, because, just a small anecdote, apparently there's a channel in Italy that basically goes through all elections, and it's this guy, this famous journalist, and he just stays awake like all night. He did like a 4-day thing. And before like the counts started, they showed a Fahrenheit 9/11 by Michael Moore, and the whole Flint situation. And we were like kind of joking. It's like, they almost lost Flint. They managed to almost lose in Flint. Like, that's how bad it is. That's how bad distrust in the Democratic Party seems to just be. And it's got to be a wake-up call of sorts. Like, just however they want to address it, right? However they think it's right to address it, it must be like, I'd imagine now, what we can get to, what the Democratic establishment thinks of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
But,
yeah, both of them are kind of like, well, this Trump train is going off a cliff. I mean, people are dying in cities that are not enforcing masks and things like that. They're having huge amounts of rates in places like South Dakota. Mm-hmm. I think I saw the statistic, 1 in 1,000 people have contracted COVID in it was North Dakota. Like, wild stuff. And so Trump, represents this sector, and that sector is not going to go away after Trump goes away. But like, they're also not enough to win political seats. And that is the crisis of the Republican Party, is to try to appear more diverse, and to appeal to more groups like Black people, Latino people, different folks, to have their message appeal to this audience, rather than, white supremacists who supported Trump because of the bigotry that, he endorsed. And the Democratic Party, on the other hand, has said the reason why they almost lost was because defunding the police and other progressive slogans were too intense. Which is like a joke, because that's probably the reason why they barely won, is because the Black Lives Matter network in particular formed a PAC to raise money for them and fundraised for them and organized people to vote for Biden. It doesn't mean that doesn't mean people even support Biden. That just means they voted for him to get rid of Trump. So in Los Angeles, you didn't see a ton of Biden Harris stickers. It wasn't even like Hillary Clinton where you'd see like I'm with her or some stuff. Like you didn't see that. It was just people were like, we have to get rid of Trump. We have to get rid of Trump. We have to get rid of Trump. So now that Biden's here, he's been elected by a populace that doesn't really like him and doesn't trust him. And a movement that, although they're not as much in the streets, hasn't forgotten the fury and the empowerment that they had over the summer. People haven't forgotten that they stood up to the police, that they intimidated them, and that they intimidated Trump. People haven't forgotten those things, and that they could do it again.
Okay, well, that's encouraging to say the least. And we were talking about COVID and COVID, still raging on, the situation just out of control, and we have comrades that work with Left Voice who are especially active, in the medical sector and just on the other side of the country. And just on this topic, I was thinking about how we just like a week ago, I believe, we just seen a strike organized by healthcare workers in New York. And this was one of the states in which the pandemic had developed most rapidly, and it keeps just being some uncontrollable beast. And how is the transition to the next administration being interpreted by this sector of the working class, just the medical sector? And would you say there is a renewed possibility of fighting and pushing for a universal healthcare system, which was also a big slogan that came up a lot in both, radical political environments and at the Democratic National Convention? So it's obviously, something people care about. And do you think there's a higher possibility right now to fight for this through the instrument of strikes and collective bargaining and whatnot?
So I think like right now, there is more of a lull, I would say, in terms of people being in the streets. There is a strike that happened in Montefiore in New York that happened. And, healthcare workers are still facing issues like short staffing. I think austerity has started to rear its head where some places are getting shut down. Nurses are getting laid off. I mean, it's ridiculous. I think there's more of a normalization of the pandemic. Like, this is not like a shocker, like, oh my God, how is this happening? We have to do something like that. It's more like, okay, yep, the pandemic. And the Democrat and Republican administrations around the country, and the Democratic Party one in New York, are really trying to cater to capital while appearing to support workers. So before they were saying, we need to shut down, this is ridiculous, Trump, how can you keep things open? Now, well, we need to open up just a little bit. And then when things are opening up, cases go up. But I think that, so that's just kind of what's happening right now. We're reacting to a Biden administration, seeing what a Biden administration will do. But Biden has been proving from his appointments of cabinet members that he's a president of austerity. And he's a president that's going to be laying people off, that's going to be forcing us, the working class, to pay for the crisis, to pay for the bailouts of trillions of dollars that they gave to the wealthiest corporations in the world. And they passed that trillions of dollars defense bill recently, passed by both Democrats and Republicans. And at the same time, there's no stimulus that's been given again to working class people. And so I think that even though there is a strike in New York, and I know that there's some strikes that are happening, some folks are trying to unionize as well, Amazon workers, that's also happening. But I think that it's going to intensify. I think that today's snapshot is not a month, 3 months from now, when moratoriums on evictions are up and haven't been renewed. Um, when they start to talk about having to lay people off, particularly public sector workers. So I think that we will be in for class struggle in the workplace and in the community against evictions. And I think that's also why the Democratic Party administrators, Biden and Harris, have defended the police, because their police are going to be the ones that are evicting people. The police are going to be the ones laying people off. I mean, that are going to be stopping strikes and beating people up at the picket lines. The police are going to be the ones taking that position. So they need the police, and they're going to be using the police to brutalize us. So there's going to be more intensity, I think, fights. And I think also those fights are going to take place outside of some of the usual labor struggles. There's going to be wildcat strikes. This is my opinion, just of seeing what's happening now, because the Democrats have no answer for the working class. They have no response for austerity except to try to make us pay for it.
Okay, no, yeah. Just there was also another question on unions, but I guess we'll get there when we get there. And so
whatever you want.
I'm gonna try and stick to sort of table of contents. Okay, there we go. Yeah, you mentioned obviously in the beginning it's kind of impossible to discuss the states today. Well, just in general, the history of the states without discussing the complex racial dynamics of power, of culture, of just more wider perspective. And this year has been I believe for many people outside of the US, just a massive wake-up call for those, like if you weren't listening in 2014, you're listening now. So the Black Lives Matter movement, it's been reinvigorated and strengthened with great energy after, tragic murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Floyd, Breonna Taylor, just so many others. It's kind of ridiculous just recount everything. I remember writing for La Voce when Ahmaud Arbery had passed away, and it just I was looking up for data and statistics, and I just wrote. I didn't remember his name right in the moment because I still hadn't written anything. So, black man shot by police, and there was another case that had happened 30 minutes prior in Indianapolis. I just remember this of that night. It was 3 a.m. It was just
Sean Reed.
Yes. I believe it was Sean Reed. Yes, and I just sat there, and just it's truly heavy. It's taken. I can only imagine for BIPOC people. And if I'm pronouncing that correctly, I mean,
you are.
Don't have much
time
to exercise. So what can you tell us, with this explosion of anger, and just it almost seems like a sudden phenomenon when it happened, at least in media representations through mainstream media. It's just like one night, oh, we're good, and there's COVID, and we're going to do this, and the next night, oh no, the country's on fire and everything's wrong. And how would you say, what can you tell us about how we got to this point, like to 2020, as far as Black Lives Matter goes, and just the organizational networks of people of color that have greatly evolved ever since it was just a rally cry, and especially how has the youth groups how have they contributed to the mobilizations around the country?
Okay. So let's see. How can I help folks understand? So the development of U.S. and Western European capitalism is based on chattel slavery, the Industrial Revolution in particular. And Marx wrote extensively about this as well. In order to have textiles, you had to have cotton. In order for there to be cotton, someone had to pick it, and it was Black enslaved people that did it. And the United States in particular created a culture and laws, what Marx calls a superstructure, an ideology that was racialized in order to maintain the super exploitation of Black people, and also to convince white people ideologically and culturally to consider themselves superior. And that is intertwined with the history of this country. And of course, as this country exports itself, it also exports its ideology. And so the US capitalist experience also exports anti-Blackness, even to places where Black people don't even live. So it's important to understand that that's the context of the development of this country. And the police within that context played a role of protecting private property. In that case, slave patrols. So picking up people, human beings, as property and returning them to their masters. And in every aspect of this country's development, Black people have been treated inferiorly. And if you can look, it's very easy to find any statistic. Healthcare, schools, food, jobs, Black people are always paid worse, and Black women in particular are paid even worse. And so that's existed since this country's existence. But with Black Lives Matter in this year, it developed more so in a response to the pandemic, as I was saying, and the economic crisis. So a lot of youth, unemployed youth, participated in these struggles, or youth who were working in precarious jobs deemed essential. So you can work at a hospital, you're called an essential worker. You can work at McDonald's and you're called an essential worker. Okay, so both of those two different kind of contexts, but you have a lot of youth that are either unemployed or precarious, that whose jobs are not, guaranteed to them, not in unions, and a lot of those folks are in the streets. And they're in the streets because, in part because of the particular situation. So with Ahmaud Arbery, he was murdered by two basically white supremacist vigilantes. But George Floyd was murdered by police. And it kind of, and in that also that context was the unequal attack on Black people for violating laws. So you could have a house party where people are violating social distancing, police come in and bust it up and beat up Black youth. At the same time, you have Trump anti-maskers not social distancing at their rallies and the police supporting them. Why? Because they know that those people are on the side of the police, and the police protect and defend white supremacists and right-wing people. They beat up Black people and they beat up protesters. And so when George Floyd was murdered, there had already been this tense situation. And the way he was murdered, strangled to death in full view, broad daylight, in front of a crowd of people, recording him on a cell phone for 9 minutes, crying for his life and pleading for his already deceased mother. It was a provocation, and it was like a declaration of war to me. It was, looking into the camera's eye, saying, "I can do what I want with impunity." And he had already killed someone years before. Derek Chauvin had. So that just erupted all the fury that had already happened, and the lack of a solution from the first Black Lives Matter uprising. Obama had no answers for what happened with police. He said Trayvon Martin, who was killed by the vigilante, could have been my son. And that's it. That's it. He didn't have any answers about that. He didn't have any solutions for that. None of the Democrats did. And the Black Lives Matter leaders kind of in the end endorsed at first Bernie Sanders and then Hillary Clinton and Elizabeth Warren. This year, I think this year there was more of a polarization within the movement itself. Because this year, was from the years prior, millions and millions of dollars have gone into the Black Lives Matter official global network without there being financial transparency. And now recently, the BLM 10 chapters that were part of the network, I'm not sure if you know about this, issued a statement calling for financial transparency, which is an organizational issue. But I think more than that, the political break is regarding the Democratic Party, because the Black Lives Matter Global Network raised, I think, about $10 million in a PAC, just like a, what is it, political action committee, which is founded just to fundraise for the Biden campaign. And they fundraised for him. They did a huge webinar conference with Black Votes Matter, the Movement for Black Lives. They all put all their money towards the Biden campaign, and before that, towards the Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders campaign, respectively, from Patrisse Cullors and Alicia Garza. So there's now been more of that discussion about people really discussing what does abolition of the police mean, besides even just defunding the police. What does it mean to do that? And talking about actually not just having a policy, creating different policies within an inherently oppressive and racist system, but how do we actually challenge the system, and how do we challenge the police? And that's happening right now. A statement was issued last week. I'm sorry if I'm talking too much. It's a lot to translate.
No, you're so helpful, honestly. It's so hard, I believe, from here to get a pulse. Like, you would not imagine how many white commentators. Shit. Technically, I'm guilty of it if I write articles and that, but I just thought about, mainstream media here. I know it's not, it's usually used as a buzzword, even right-wing circles, but it's so many white Italian dudes trying to discuss such complex and, as you said, intertwined topics which touch on so many aspects of American political life, and they just fucking Minnesota burns, and we're gonna talk about this now, and you turn on the TV and someone's trying to talk about that, and there are no black activists, there are no black voices, black working class voices, but shit, I'm just gonna say black voices, because the idea that they would seek out black working class voices,
that's another, and that's also part of it, because the nonprofit industrial complex really plays on the weaknesses of a lot of left groups to not really have a relationship. And it's not just that they don't have a relationship. In the United States in particular, and if you see behind me, there's a Black Panther little calendar there.
There it is. Okay.
Those are people who call themselves revolutionary socialists, and yet aren't considered socialists in the left discourse. They're kind of they're the black, not the socialists. And they were both. And the reason why they were massacred and attacked and incarcerated, and many of them currently incarcerated, was to sever that revolutionary continuity of socialism and fighting against racism and capitalism. And that was a conscious decision. So it isn't something that was always existed for eternal. There were times in history, political history, where those relationships were stronger and they were intentionally severed. In the 1930s, they were stronger, and because of the political mistakes and reactionary character of Stalinism, and then from the McCarthy era, that severed those relationships between the fight against racism and the fight for socialism. And then in the 1960s, where you had more social-based movements that weren't as much based in the workplace, and didn't focus on the working class as the revolutionary subject, you had more kind of other issues that came about from that. And even when people attempted to do it, like Fred Hampton, for example, who created the Rainbow Coalition, even when people attempted to do it, he was assassinated in his bed while he slept. And so were many other Panthers. In Los Angeles, there were more Black Panthers assassinated by the police than any other city in the United States. So I say this to say that there are historical things that were intentionally took place to sever the revolutionary tradition. And now that we have this Black Lives Matter fight, and the questioning of, we're not just trying to make money, or get our names, put out there. We're not just trying to get a nonprofit where we make, a little bit of money and make the system just a little bit better. People are talking about abolition. And if we talk about abolition of the police, the only way we can do that is the abolition of capitalism. And so, and when Obama said defunding the police, we shouldn't, that's a snappy slogan, and really tried to play that down. This person who's bombed African countries, who's murdered Black people and defended the police at every turn that he possibly could, he revealed himself. And other activists didn't just go along with it because he was the first Black president. People are not for presidents at all. So I guess what I'm saying is that I have more confidence that there is developing more of a current among young people, Black people, white people, Latino people, people of color, working class people, that are questioning the legitimacy of the system and its right to exist. And also seeing, because of the colossal pandemic that we've gone through, people are seeing that, you can shut down an entire country within a matter of weeks. And people are also seeing that these other folks that are working, those people are responsible for this country, anything happening in this country. And I think folks are seeing that and kind of having more of more bold ideas, and wanting to take more bold steps. And I think we, as the revolutionary socialist press, need to be attempting to engage them, and discussing with each other, internationally as well.